Back in December, some of you probably remember this, there was that series of tornadoes that went through Tennessee and Kentucky. A couple of them ended up in Illinois. They did a tremendous amount of damage. And one of the things that happened, there was a story that came out of this if you're watching the news, but one of the things that happened in this tornadoes, there was a grandma who was watching a couple of kids. They were little babies, and she heard the sirens going off, and she's there in her house, and here's the rumbling of the tornado bearing down on her. And I've never had that experience, but I could just imagine the terror of it. And so she still was able to think it through, and what she did was grab up these two babies, run into an interior room, which happened to be the bathroom, deposit the kids with some blankets inside of the bathtub, put a Bible in on them, and then the winds hit and started tearing the house apart all around her. And in fact, she says she was hanging on to the bathtub because this thing started to lift off. And she did that until she got smacked in the back of the head by the water heater. And so, of course, she was completely terrified and distraught. The rescuers showed up on the scene shortly thereafter. The place is a mess. The tornado left a long trail. And she's like, there's two babies out here somewhere. And amazingly, she had put these little kids in the bathtub for refuge. Amazingly, at the edge of the property where they were out there in Kentucky, they found the bathtub flipped over, pulled out both of these kids wrapped in their blankets, and they had to go to the hospital, but they were okay. They survived. And I'm struck by this story because here is this moment, this placing these children in that refuge. The winds come, tear everything apart, and it strikes me as kind of this image for our year because we are focusing on God as our refuge and strength. And we're thinking about how life can send winds and waves, things that threaten to tear us apart, but there is God being our refuge, being the one who protects us from this storm, just like that grandma placing those little babies in that bathtub. You know, last week we looked at Psalm 46. God is our refuge. God is our strength. And we just sang a version of that. And that's kind of been my breath prayer over these last few weeks. Breathe in, God be my refuge. Breathe out, God be my strength. And this year, I hope we can really come back to that image of God as our refuge and strength. And this week, as we're looking at Exodus chapter 33, we see another image of refuge, this one with Moses. And I think what we learn from this image is that when we take refuge in God, what we're doing above all else is seeking the presence of God. We want to seek God's presence first. Now, I bet you know this story. Let me just frame it up for you. Book of Exodus, part of the Torah, part of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In the Exodus, we know Moses goes in. I'll tell it to you quick. Moses goes into Egypt because God sends him to rescue the people of Israel. They've been in slavery for 400 years, and Moses goes in there. There are the plagues. There's the talking of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he brings out this huge number of people, the people of Israel, and they go out into the desert. They're released from slavery. They're headed towards their God in the promised land. Everything should be good, right? Like that would kind of be like the end of the story, except it's not. The people grumble and grumble, right? Famously in the desert, they're like, "What? Weren't there enough tombs back in Egypt? We used to eat leeks and good food back in Egypt. Yeah, we were slaves, but hey, in some ways it was cushier than this." And there's manna and there's quail, and they get to the Mount Sinai, and it's this key point, and that's where they're at right here. It's this key point. Moses goes up Mount Sinai. He's on the mountain in the presence of God at the very beginning of this experience. They're close to the beginning of this experience. In chapter 24, Moses is up there and he says, "No one is to come up the mountain with me," but he brings some of the leaders of the people of Israel sort of halfway up. They're in the presence of God. They eat with God there. And then Moses continues his ascent up into this place that's described as a cloud, as smoke, as fire, as trumpet sounds, right? It's just this mighty, holy, terrifying presence of God. And that is where he goes for 40 days and 40 nights. And Moses in the cloud, it says he doesn't eat or drink. He's fasting. And he's completely sustained by the power of God, the presence of God when he's up there. Now here's the part where we kind of pick up. When he's up there, he leaves his assistant, a guy named Joshua, a young guy who's kind of following him around, learning the ropes, leaves him on the halfway point down the mountain. He comes back down. In chapter 32, Joshua's like, "I think there's a battle down there." But God has already revealed to Moses what's going on, that it's not a battle. It is the people of Israel running amok. And in fact, they've built this golden calf, thanks to his brother, the priest Aaron, who capitulated to their desire to have a tangible God in front of them. And they're worshiping and dancing around in front of this golden calf. And Moses goes down there and he destroys the tablets in his hands that he was bringing down from the mountain, the tablets of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. He destroys the golden calf, burns it, grinds it up, makes them drink it, and then he ends up going back up the mountain. So that's where we're at. Hope you followed that all. Chapter 33, that's where we're at. Moses goes back up the mountain. Well, I should say, okay, he goes back up the mountain, but not quite yet. First Moses is in the camp with the people, and he just doesn't know what to do. Right, he brought him out of Egypt. That's what God told him to do. He's seen God's power so far. And in chapter 33, there he is. And he goes to something called the tent of meeting. Now, there's two tents that are really important in the book of Exodus. One is called the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is this tent that God gives the design for. It is built, it is situated right in the center of the Israelite camp, because that is the place where what is called the Ark of the Covenant will be at, and that is the place where sacrifices are offered, both of incense and of animals, and then that is where the worship happens. But this is a little different. This is called the tent of meeting. It is something that Moses uses. He goes outside of the camp, and in the tent of meeting, he just gets into the presence of God. Now, Joshua, again, goes with him. But here Moses goes out to the tent of meeting, and after this he'll go up the mountain. But he's in the tent of meeting, and he just lays it out before God. He needs a refuge. It's this moment where, verse 12, he lays it out before God, and he says, God, you have been telling me, lead these people. In other words, God, you gave me a call. God, you told me what to do, but here I am. What am I supposed to be doing now? Because you saw what happened, right? And there's some question about exactly what Moses was thinking, because he was up on the mountain and God gave him the tablets of the covenant, those 10 commandments, written on the front and the back. It's the only place where we have something that is written. It says, with the very finger of God. So it wasn't God telling Moses what to chisel into those tablets. They're somehow written by the very power of God. That's the only thing like that. And Moses comes down the mountain. Now, God had warned Moses ahead of time. He said, by the way, people of Israel are running amok down there. But Moses just kind of takes that in stride and goes down carrying the tablets anyway. And when he gets there and when he sees it, he breaks the tablet. Now, here there's a little bit of dispute. When the ancient rabbis, for example, they wondered, why did Moses break the tablets at that point? What does that mean? Because he knew God had already told him what was happening. And why did he break them at that point? Why did he come down the mountain at all? Why did he carry the tablets with them? And some thought, well, maybe he wanted to come down the mountain and he was going to read to them from the tablets. And he hoped that although their hearts had gone astray, their minds had not, and he could bring them back by letting them hear the words of the covenant. But then he realized it was impossible. Or maybe he thought just by seeing the commandments that would bring them back. Or maybe some ancient rabbis thought he came down, and when he saw that, he just kind of collapsed and the tablets fell out of his hands. But it says that he was carrying the tablets down and he just got angry. Maybe it's that simple. He was so mad he just took the tablets and threw them on the ground. I'll admit that's how I've always thought about it when I was a kid. But there's Moses, the tablets are broken, the covenant's broken, his relationship with God is kind of what am I supposed to do now? It's all on the line, because God had said, look, I'll make a people out of you, just forget about all these folks. But Moses keeps coming back to the people of Israel and saying, hey, these are your people. You've been telling me lead these people. Now, what am I supposed to do? Because here we are, God. It's all on the line. And this is really a pivotal moment for Moses. It's really kind of a crisis of faith for him, and I think that's important to notice. The story of Exodus, it's a story of God with his people, God rescuing his people, but it's also the story of Moses and his own faith as it develops. Because remember Moses' personal story. He was a Hebrew kid. They were going to kill him, but they put him in that basket and floated him on the Nile, and he was picked up by the Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, and was raised in luxury and educated there in the palace. He ends up killing somebody, going back out into the desert, spending some time in there figuring things out, picks up a wife in the meantime, and comes back in at God's call at the burning bush to try to save his people with these promises and these powers and Aaron to go with them. It's Moses learning to know God this whole time. It's Moses trying to kind of figure out, who am I? Right? Do I belong to the temple, to the palace? Do I belong with these people? Do I belong in the desert? What does it mean for me to be this man of God, this prophet, this leader? And here he is again, like he's kind of feeling rejected, right? Like all I did was go up the mountains 40 days and I lost them. And he's saying, God, that's verse 12, you have been telling me lead these people, right? There it is. It's Moses' story and it's God's mission coming to a head right there. And he's saying that to God, and he's kind of laying out the promises, right? You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me, right? God, you told me this. And what Moses does is he lays out 3 different requests. And these requests are really important as we think about finding refuge in God, and as we think about what it means to come into God's presence. There's 3 different requests. So Moses says in verse 13, if you're following with me, if you are pleased with me, teach me your ways. All right, so that's the first request. Teach me your ways. Now listen, during this whole time, Moses has been learning the ways of God in a certain sense, right? I mean, God has given the 10 commandments. That's, what more do you want? That's the heart of God's ways. In chapter 20, the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments are unfolded in the rest of the law. So, thou shalt not kill is unfolded, so you know how that plays out when it comes to laws of war, when it comes to how you treat prisoners, when it comes to disputes. Like, there's all these kind of permutations for what that looks like. Or thou shalt not commit adultery, right? So there's all these different ways that is then kind of explained in the law. God has also not just given the moral law, but given the ritual law. So on top of the 10 commandments and their unfolding, you see in the book of Exodus up to this point, and it will continue after this point, all the regulations of how to build the tabernacle, build the altar, the vestments for the priests, the way you're supposed to worship God, how you're supposed to keep the Sabbath, all of these ritual aspects that play into what it means to be the people of God. So you've got right worship, and you got right practice, and God's been teaching Moses those things. But here's Moses. He says, verse 13, if you are pleased with me, teach me your ways. That's his first request. So he's in the tent of meeting. He's gone out to seek God. It's this deep time of prayer. He's all alone except for Joshua, and I don't know if Joshua's sitting beside him or kind of at the tent, outside of the tent. But here's Moses. That's his first request. And what's he mean? Teach me your ways. I think it's probably a little bit different than teach me the laws. I mean, God's been doing that. I think this is something personal for Moses. It's Moses saying, look, I want to know what you want me to do. Have you ever had that conversation with God? Right? What do you want me to do? It's Paul on the road to Damascus, right? He says, the third time he tells his story about how he met Jesus on the road, he says, what do you want me to do, Lord? I mean, here's Moses. What do you want me to do? These are your people. This is your charge. Teach me your ways. I think that's the first thing that Moses is asking. He goes to God, and he needs refuge in the sense of some kind of explanation, some kind of meaning to everything that's been happening, some direction on the way forward. That's the first way Moses is seeking refuge. And notice how God responds. Verse 14, it's prayer time. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I'll give you rest. So Moses seeks what? This intellectual refuge, and God says, my presence will go with you. God says, I will be with you. You'll have rest, right? So God answers with presence. Verse 15. Okay, Moses picks this up. He kind of talks about if your presence, if your presence wouldn't go with us, what chance do we have? And then Moses asks another question. He asks another question. Hold on. It's risky to walk away from the manuscript, folks. But Moses asks another question here after teach me your ways. He said it was actually before that. He says, you have not let me know who I'm sending, who you will send with me. So before that, Moses says, not only what am I supposed to do, but he asks God, who am I supposed to do it with? right? So that's the first question that he asks. The second question is, what do you want me to do, right? But who am I supposed to be doing it with? And so, that was the question Moses had asked when he met God in the burning bush. He's like, all right, what's your name? But I'm not going by myself. Who are you going to send with me? And God gave him Aaron, right? Back at that point, Moses had tried to say, well, I can't talk so good. And he said, well, bring Aaron along. He's pretty good. But it turns out Aaron has he's got his limitations. Those were revealed when Moses went up on the mountain. I mean, Aaron, you can count on him to perform the priestly rituals in front of the tabernacle, but when push comes to shove, he was a pushover. When they asked, when they wanted a god to worship, an idol to be able to see of God, they were like, Moses, that guy that brought us out, not God who brought us out of Egypt, but Moses, that guy that brought us out of Egypt, he's gone. And we want a God to go before us. And so Aaron capitulated and did that. So Moses is saying, who are you going to send with me, right? I need somebody to go with me. And it's just like this question, like, what am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to do it with, right? These two questions that go together. Now, of course, God's been preparing somebody to go with him this whole time. And we keep getting these little clues. This young guy named Joshua, who's going to have a whole book named after him because he turns out to be the brave one, the energetic one, the zealous one, the guy who's going to carry the mission forward when Moses, in fact, dies before the people enter the promised land. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to do it with? Those are Moses' first two questions, and then there is a third, or a third request. Verse 18, this is the key one. Moses said, now show me your glory. So God answers Moses by saying, I'm going to be present with you. And then in the end, Moses says, okay, fine, show me your glory. And look what God does. And he says, I will cause my goodness to pass in front of you. And then God does appear to Moses. But it's this moment, show me your glory. That's kind of like the culmination of what Moses is seeking. He's not just seeking answers. He's not just seeking a helper. He's seeking the very heart of God, the very presence of God. And so when we take refuge, when we talk about what it means to take refuge in God, it means ultimately to seek God's presence above all else. It means to come to the heart of God. And I think Moses got that. God is instructing him, but Moses also gets that. That's why he was with God here in the tent of meeting in the first place. He says, now show me your glory. He says, I want to see you in some way, right? And God says, you cannot see me and live. This is repeated throughout the scriptures. Back in chapter 24, it says that the leaders of Israel saw God, but then it's kind of like wavers a little bit because they describe the stones under his feet, which gives you an impression that they didn't look directly at God, but looked at kind of like at his feet. God says, I will put you in a cleft of the rock. I will pass by. You will see my back. Later in Isaiah, Isaiah will see the hem of God's robe in the temple, right? There's this way you cannot see God. Even the seraphim, these angels around God, they guard their eyes because of kind of this holy radiation, the kavod, the glory of God that comes off of him. No mortal being, no immortal being can look upon that and live. Now, and it means a couple of different things. In one way, we're saying that, God, you can't see God. You can't see infinity, right? God is above all else. God's presence is in all things. You can't kind of take that in. That's not possible. But in another way, it means that God's holiness is just too much to bear. It's like the book of Hebrews says, our God is a consuming fire. No one can see my face and live, right? To come into God's presence, our sin separates us, and so we can't be in that presence. But in another way, it's also God's incomprehensible mystery, right? To look into God, to see God would be to somehow know God fully, and that's just not possible. All we can ever know is like God's back, and we can know what we need to know. We see the reflection of the image of God in the face of Christ, but Jesus, in his coming, he sort of, by putting on flesh, makes it possible for us to be in God's presence and see him. and not be destroyed. The disciples came to Jesus and said, let us see the Father and we'll be satisfied. In John 14, and Jesus said, look, I've been walking around with you the whole time. How can you say to me, let us see the Father? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so here's what God does. He takes Moses, like that grandma putting those kids in a bathtub, and he puts him in the cleft of a rock. Now get this, in one way, that cleft of a rock is kind of like a shelter from God. Did you follow the logic of this? Right, because you can't see God and live, and so he's putting Moses in the cleft of the rock so that he won't be destroyed by the holy presence of God when God comes by. That's a little bit like how when they're walking the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, like no human hand is supposed to touch it. It rocks. One of David's guys reaches up there and touches it and dies immediately, and David gets so upset with God. He's like, who do you think I am? We're with you. Why did you kill my friend? But it's God's holy presence. And God's kind of protecting Moses from the kind of hurricane of that presence. But in ancient tradition, that image of the cleft of the rock, that's Jesus. And just like the song we sang, that Jesus is the one who brings us into himself, into his refuge. Like Paul says, we put on Christ. We are baptized into Christ. We come into Christ. And then we are able to go into the presence of God because we are in Christ. And we're in the cleft of the rock. So in that sense, it's this foreshadowing of God finding a way to bring his people to his very heart, into his presence. And so this is God saying, come to me. God is the rock. It's just like Jesus will later say that the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. It's like Paul will later say in 1 Corinthians that the rock in the desert that gave the Israelites water, that was Jesus. And here's this image of God being the rock, Jesus being the cleft in the rock who makes it possible for us to come in to God's presence. And what this all means is that you see Moses go into God seeking refuge. Who am I supposed to do this all with? What am I supposed to do? And God's saying, my presence, come into the cleft of the rock, I will be present to you. Above all else, Moses is seeking God and he wants God. And above all else, we got to be seeking God's presence. That's why I hope we can hear that today. I hope we can think about that as we enter into this year of refuge, that wherever we need refuge, whatever struggles we might have, we are above all seeking God's presence weekly and daily and hourly. Just at all moments seeking to be in that cleft of the rock. We often seek God's favor. We often, like Moses, say, what do you want me to do? And seek God's will. Or we often seek God's help and say, who am I supposed to do this with? But we gotta be seeking God above all else, like Moses. Whatever ideas Moses might have had when he came back down that mountain, maybe, teaching the people, trying to bring him back, finding some way to find people who would come along with him. Whatever Moses was thinking, it just all fell apart in his hands. And so the covenant is in pieces, and the people are a hot mess, and Moses' confidence is completely shaken, and the only thing he can do is just step back and go to the tent of meeting and seek God's presence again. And I think that's us, right? We got to just go and take our worries and anxieties and prayer, and we got to go back to the one thing that matters, that cleft in the rock, and seek God's presence and hear God's repeated answer again and again and again, I am with you. There's two things that come out of this. So the first thing is this. We seek God's presence above all else, go to the cleft of the rock. The first thing is this, that is what God wants. That has been God's desire from the very beginning, is to have us in intimate communion with him. God wants to do like he did back in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden, where he'd walk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening, and they were completely naked to him. He knew them, they knew him, and it was beautiful, and it was broken by sin. That is what God has designed us for, is to be in that kind of presence. That is God's heart. That is God's love for us, to have us close to him. That is why God sent Jesus. That is why Jesus did what he did. That is why we place our hope in him, because he's not a God who is far off, but a God who desires to be with him. And what he wants above all else is for us to be focused on him and love him. Remember Jesus' commandment. or Jesus teaching that the first commandment, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's where you start. Nothing else matters if you can't get that one down. All of our plans, all of our questions about what we should be doing, above all else, we got to be seeking God. That is what God wants. And the second thing, this is what we need. We got to come into God's presence. We're not going to be able to do it on our own. We're not going to be able to find the strength to fulfill what God is calling us to, or even just to fulfill kind of our day-to-day plans if we're not able to come into God's presence and be with him. And this maybe is harder than it sounds. Moses went to the tent of meeting. He was by himself with God. Joshua, somewhere in the vicinity. But being by yourself in the presence of God, Moses has just done 40 days up on the mountain. Now he's in the tent of meeting. He's going to do 40 more days again after that and come down with the second set of tablets. That being in the presence of God, for whatever reason, call it sin, call it the way our brains have been shaped by entertainment and distractions, it's hard for us. There was a study a couple of years ago that came out. I get a kick out of this. There was a study that came out, and they put people in a room by themselves, and the only thing they had in that room was a little button. And they're in a little chair by themselves, and they're, maybe there's like one of those windows, those one-way mirrors where people are, the researchers are in there looking at them, and so the people are sitting there with this little button. Now, they have no distractions. If they press the little button, do you know what happens? They give themselves an electric shock. And it turns out that people would sit there in that room with no distractions, and so you kind of have a choice between like giving yourself an electric shock and just kind of like sitting quietly with your own thoughts. And what do you think most people chose? They sat there and shocked themselves. That was better and more interesting to get shocked than just to kind of sit there in quiet. Now, I'd take that room any day, right? Just go sit there in some quiet. But most of us struggle with this to some extent, being in the presence of God and just sitting there with God in quiet. We're kind of back to Moses' questions. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to do it with? It's like, just come to me. And a couple years ago, last winter, actually, I did this prayer retreat, and I took a bunch of books, and I took my computer, and I was ready to kind of like get in some reading time and stuff. And then the leader of the retreat up at this monastery said, okay, I recommend that you don't do any reading. And by the way, we're not going to talk during these 3 days. And the other thing is that don't like be doing phone calls and stuff. Just maintain silence and be in the presence of God. And I was like, okay. So this became less of a kind of reading and relaxation retreat and more like prayer boot camp for me, which it was good, right? But there I was, it's like this is new for me, that kind of focused intensity. Or I remember a couple years ago, we did this little training thing, and somebody was supposed to teach us about prayer, and we sat down, and I had my notebook out, and she says, okay, we all know how to pray. Let's just listen to some music, and we'll pray. And I remember being so disoriented by that. It's like, well, even the disciples asked Jesus, teach us to pray, right? So do we know, right? Do we actually know how to come into that silent presence and be with God in his presence? This is going to be harder for us than I think a lot of times we realize. And so what God is saying is, come to me and just be with me and just be silent before me and give me a chance to minister to you out of my presence. Come to the cleft of the rock. It's what we need. And look, there's going to be all sorts of things that will happen in life. There might be financial situations, things that we're going to be praying fervently to God about. We're saying, God, I need a breakthrough. And we might pray about, family stressors, or maybe it's those big questions of what do we do next? Maybe where do I go study, or what job should I do? Those sorts of things. But here's God saying, just come into my presence. Whatever you need a refuge from, above all else, come to me. In the end, we don't just need solutions from God, we need God. As St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And what I've discovered is that when we come to God and we find our refuge in him, then out of his goodness and abundant love, he starts to give us some of those other things that we need, because he knows that we need them. Now remember Jesus' teaching. Jesus said, seek ye first not answers to your questions, not the people to do what you need to do with, not fixes. He said, seek ye first the kingdom of God. And all these other things will be added unto you. And there's something to that, right? When we get God at the center and really focus on God and come into his presence, there's a way in which, all right, not everything just gets fixed magically, but there's a way in which it has this ripple effect and other stuff starts to fall in line and to find its right priority in our lives. And God does give us fixes because God loves us. And he wants to see our lives thrive and flourish. He wants us to grow towards him and become Christ-like. That's his goal above all else. And he's going to do that in our lives. And here's where it really requires faith. Because to come into God's presence as a refuge means saying, God, I trust that you really have my best interests at heart. And that I don't have to kind of keep laying it out in front of you, that if I just come to you and I'm just with you, that you know me through and through, you know my past, and you know what's happening in the future, and that you will respond to me with what I need. That's faith right there. To just come into his presence and sit with him. And I think above all else, that's what it means to take refuge in God. To just breathe in, breathe out. God be my refuge. God be my strength. Just say with, like Jesus did, Jesus, be my gate. Let me come in and go out and find pasture in you. To pray right along with Moses, Lord, show me your glory, right? Whatever else you need, Lord, show me your glory. It's this prayer to know God, to experience God's presence, to come to the heart of God and find our deepest refuge in him. Lord, show me your glory. And just trusting that if we are with him, then he knows what we'll need and he'll make it right. Well, friends, as we're beginning this new year, wherever you are at, whatever you're experiencing, whether that is a sense of God's goodness and purpose for your life or a sense of frustration and anxiety, wherever you're at, I pray that you have a glimpse of God's glory. I pray that you would go to him and be able to discover that abundant, expansive, satisfying refuge that he's got for his people.